Synopsis. Synopsis. Chapter 1. Chapter 1. Science and Society: An Overview of the Problem. Science promised to society to contribute to the grand challenges of the United Nations, WHO, the EU agenda and national agendas for change and improvement of our life. It will be discussed how this social contract between science and society has developed since 1945. The first phase from 1945 till 1960 was characterized by autonomy, building on the successes of the natural sciences and engineering in World War II. In the second phase, the late 1960s till approximately 1980, government and the public lost trust and saw the downside of science and technology. The response from politics and the public was a call for societal and political responsible research inspired by broader socio-political developments in society. The third phase from 1980 till 2010 was built on the idea that science and technology would bring economic growth, which should make nations internationally competitive. There was also increasingly room for societal problems related to environment and sustainability, health and well-being. In this approach of the so-called knowledge economy, strong relations with government and the private sector were established, characterized by short-term accountability, control from government and funders at the level of project output, using accordingly defined metrics and indicators. This model became firmly and globally institutionalized. Within science, since 2010 among scientists there is growing frustration, mostly implicit but increasingly explicit disillusion of scientists, regarding governance, agenda setting in relation to the outside world and significant impact of the research. Science fails, it is felt, its promise to society to contribute to the quality of life as the system has adapted to the culture of new public management. Production of robust and significant results is mainly secondary to output relevant for an internal credit system for academic career advancement at the individual level. At the higher organizational level, output and impact are focused on positions on international ranking lists, which drive highly competitive social systems, which results in a widely felt lack of alignment and shared value in the academic community. Synopsis. Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Images of Science. A Reality Check. It will be argued that the dominant form of current academic science is based on ideas and concepts about science and research that date back to philosophy and sociology that was developed since the 1930s. It will be discussed how this philosophy and sociology of science has informed the ideas, myths and ideology about science held by the scientific community and still determines the popular view of science. It is even more amazing when we realize that these ideas are philosophically and sociologically untenable and since the 1970s were declared obsolete by major scholars in these same disciplines. To demonstrate this, I delve deep to discuss the distinct stages that scholars in philosophy, sociology and history of science since 1945 to 2000 have gone through to leave the analytical positivistic philosophy behind. I will be focusing on developments of their thinking about major topics such as how scientific knowledge is produced, the scientific method, the status of scientific knowledge and the development of our ideas about truth, and the relation of our claims to reality. It will appear that the positivistic ideas about science producing absolute truth, about the unique scientific method, its formal logical approach and its timeless foundation as a guarantee for our value-free, objective knowledge were not tenable. I took the trouble to go into this deep to show how thoroughly the myth has been demystified in philosophy and sociology of science. You think after these 50 pages I am kicking a dead horse? Not at all. This scientific demystification has unfortunately not reached active scientists. The popular image of science and research is still largely based on that legend. This is not without consequence, as will be shown in Chapter 3. These images of science have shaped and in fact distorted the organizational structures and the interaction between its institutes and disciplines. It also affects the relationship of science with its stakeholders in society, its funders, the many publics, private and public, and policymakers in government. In short, it is about the growth of knowledge. It will throughout the book be accompanied by a narrative in which I will take my own intellectual and scientific journey from 1971 as a chemistry student who did a minor in the philosophy of science in academic year 1975 to 1976. Since then I followed the classical career path of a professional biochemist, immunologist, as PhD student, postdoc, group leader, department head, director of a small research institute, to finally become dean and board member of a large university medical center. Going through this professional sequence, I kept a persistent and ever stronger interest in the science of science. It is from the perspective of a true understanding of the practice of science in its various aspects that I will use specific authors a lot, but others much less or even neglect work of many scholars that to specialists in the different fields are considered important but are of little or no relevance for the daily practice of active researchers and most other actors in the field. Synopsis. Chapter 3. Chapter 3. Science in Transition: How Science Goes Wrong and What to Do About It. Science in Transition, which started in 2013, is a small-scale Dutch initiative. It presented a systems approach, comprised of analyses and suggested actions, based on experience in academia. It was built on writings by early science watchers and most recent theoretical developments in philosophy, history and sociology of science and STS on the practice and politics of science. This chapter will include my personal experiences as one of the 4 Dutch founders of Science in Transition. I will discuss the message and the various forms of reception over the past 6 years by the different actors in the field, including administrators in university, academic societies and ministries of higher education, economic affairs and public health, but also from leadership in the private sector. I will report on my personal experience of how these myths and ideologies play out in the daily practice of 40 years of biomedical research in policy and decision-making in lab meetings, at departments, at grant review committees of funders and in the boardrooms and the offices of deans, vice-chancellors and rectors. It has in the previous chapters become clear that the ideology and ideals that we are brought up with are not valid and are not practiced, despite that even in 2020 they are still somehow believed by most scientists and even by many science watchers and journalists and used in political correct rhetoric and policy making by science's leadership. In that way, these ideologies and beliefs mostly implicitly but sometimes even explicitly determine debates regarding the internal policy of science and science policy in the public arena. These include all-time classic themes like the uniqueness of science compared to any other societal activity, ethical superiority of science and scientists based on Mertonian norms, the vocational disinterested search for truth, autonomy, values and moral, political, neutrality, dominance of internal epistemic values, and unpredictability regards impact. These ideas have influenced debates about the ideal and hegemony of natural science, the hierarchy of basic over applied science, theoretical over technological research, and at a higher level in academic institutions and at the funders the widely held supremacy of STEM over SSH. This has directly determined the attitudes of scientists in the interaction with peers within the field, but also shaped the politics of science within science, but also with policymakers and stakeholders from the public and private sector and interactions with popular media. Science, it was concluded, was suboptimal because of growing problems with the quality and reproducibility of its published products due to failing quality control at several levels. Because of too little interactions with society during the phases of agenda setting and the actual process of knowledge production, its societal impact was limited, which also relates to the lack of inclusiveness, multidisciplinarity and diversity in academia. Production of robust and significant results aiming at real-world problems is mainly secondary to academic output relevant for an internally driven incentive and reward system steering for academic career advancement at the individual level. Similarly, at the higher organizational and national level, this reward system is skewed to types of output and impact focused on positions on international ranking lists. This incentive and reward system, with flawed use of metrics, drives a hyper-competitive social game in academia which results in a widely felt lack of alignment and little shared value in the academic community. Empirical data, most of it from within science and academia, showing these problems in different academic disciplines, countries and continents are published on a weekly basis since 2014. These critiques focus on the practices of scholarly publishing, including open access and open data, and the adverse effects of the incentive and reward system. Images, ideologies and politics of science were exposed that insulate academia and science from society and its stakeholders, which distort the research agenda and subsequently its societal and economic impact. Synopsis. Chapter 4. Chapter 4. Science and Society. Pragmatism by Default. To rethink the relation between science and society and its current problems, authoritative scholars in the USA and Europe, but also around the globe, have since 1980 implicitly and increasingly explicitly gone back to the ideas of American pragmatism. Pragmatism, as conceived by its founders Peirce, James and Dewey, is known for its distinct philosophy, sociology of science and political theory. They argued that philosophy should not focus on theoretical esoteric problems with hair-splitting abstract debates of no interest to scientists because unrelated to their practice and problems in the real world. In a realistic philosophy of science, they did not accept foundationalism, dismissed the myth of given eternal principles, the unique scientific method, absolute truths, or let alone a unifying theory. They saw science as a plural, thoroughly social activity that has to be directed to real-world problems and subsequent interventions and action. Truth, in their sense, was related to the potential and possible impact of the proposition when turned into action. Knowledge claims were regarded per definition a product of the community of inquirers, fallible and through continuous testing and action were to be improved. Until 1950, this was the most influential intellectual movement in the USA, but with very little impact in Europe. Because of the dominance of the analytic positivistic approach to the philosophy of science, after 1950 it lost its standing. After the demise of analytical philosophy, in the 1980s, there was a resurgence of pragmatism led by several so-called new or neo-pragmatists. Influential philosophers like Stephen Toulmin, Hilary Putnam and Philip Kitcher, coming from the tradition of analytic philosophy, have written about their gradual conversion to pragmatism, for which in the early days they were frowned upon by esteemed colleagues. This movement gained traction first in the USA, in particular through works of Bernstein, Toulmin, Rorty, Putnam and Hacking, but also gained influence in Europe, early on through the works of Appel, Habermas and later Latour. Synopsis. Chapter 5. Chapter 5. Science in Social Contexts. Gradually since 1990 a growing number of critical analyses from within science have published on how science was organized as a system and discussing its problems, despite, or paradoxically because the growing size of its endeavor and its growing yearly output. Because of lack of openness with regard to sharing results of research, such as publications and data, but in fact of all sorts of other products, science is felt by many to disappoint with respect to its societal impact, its contribution to the major problems humanity is facing in the current times. With the financial crisis, in analogy, also the crisis of the academic system as described in Chapter 3 was exposed, and it seemed that similar systemic neoliberal economic mechanisms operated in these at first sight seemingly different industries. Most of these critiques appeared with increasing frequency since 2014 in formal scientific magazines and social media and reached the leadership of universities, government and funders. This awareness and support for the development of new ways of doing science, mostly intuitively and implicitly, but sometimes explicitly, is motivated by pragmatism aiming for societal progress and contribution to the good life. To get to this next level we need the critical reflection on the practice of science as done in previous chapters in order to make systemic changes to several critical parts of the knowledge production chain. I will discuss the different analyses of interactions between science and society, in the social and political contexts with publics and politics that show where and how we could improve. The opening up of science and academia in matters of problem choice, data sharing and evaluation of research together with stakeholders from outside academia will help to increase the impact of science on society. It ideally should promote equality, inclusion and diversity of the research agendas. This, I will argue, requires an open society with Deweyan democracy and safe spaces for deliberations where a diversity of publics and their problems can be heard. In this transition we have to pay close and continuous attention to the many effects of power executed by agents in society and science that we know can distort these ideal deliberations, and undermine the ethics of these communications and possibly threaten the autonomy and freedom of research. Synopsis. Chapter 6. Chapter 6. Science in Transition Reduced to Practice. In the true spirit of Dewey and pragmatism, knowledge, insights and experience have to be translated into interventions and actions. Only when knowledge is reduced to practice, its social robustness and value will be determined. In light of the conclusions of the previous chapter, to be able to have more impact and to hold up our promise to society, we have to reflect who our science is organized and how it could be improved. From these reflections, several interventions in the practice of research have been proposed. When we, the Science in Transition team, started to make public our critical accounts of the practice of science, I was friendly advised by influential older scientists to first clean up the mess in my own institution, instead of pointing to others and to the system. As a matter of fact, that is what we have been doing at University Medical Center Utrecht, UMC Utrecht, since 2009. In this chapter, I present a brief outline of our actions, on the ground, in UMC Utrecht, their receptions and some early actions to promote these activities abroad. Synopsis. Chapter 7. Chapter 7. Transition to Open Science. Many initiatives addressing different types of problems of the practice of science and research have been described or cited. Some were one-issue local actions, some took a broader approach at the national and some at EU level. Some stayed on, others faded after a few years. Many of the issues addressed by these movements and initiatives were part of the system of science and appeared to be systemically interdependent. This is how they converged and precipitated in the movement of open science, somewhere at the beginning of the second decade of this century. I discuss the major move that was made since 2015 in the EU to embrace the open science practice as the way science and research are being done in Europe. This elicited tensions that first foremost relate to uncertainty regarding scholarly publishing, of how and where we publish open access. But also, with respect to what immediate sharing of data and results in daily practice of researchers means, how we value and give credit for papers and published datasets. It thus poses the question of recognition and rewards, how, if at all, we must compare incomparable academic work, how we get credit and build reputations in this new open practice of science. It is indeed believed that open science with its practice of responsible science will be a major contribution to address the dominant problems in science that we have analyzed thus far, or at least will help to mitigate them. Open science holds a promise to take science to the next phase as outlined in the previous chapters. That is not a romantic naive longing for the science that once was. It will be a truly novel, but realistic way of doing scientific inquiry according to the pragmatic narrative pointed out. I will conclude this chapter reporting some of my first-hand experiences, in Brussels and during visits to several EU member states in the course of a mutual learning exercise, but also encounters in North America, Southeast Asia and South Africa where we in the past years have discussed open science. We know science and scholarship have many forms and flavors and that wherever you go around the globe, there is not one scientific community. For me, discussing the transition to open science in the past 4 years was really a learning exercise, an amazing, mostly encouraging, but many times quite shocking, humbling and even sometimes saddening experience. The transition to open science, as can be anticipated from the analyses above, will not be trivial. The recent discussions have already shown that the transition to open science, even in different EU member states, is a very different thing because of specific national, cultural and academic contexts.